back now to some of the finances and talk about equity, because I know this is oftentimes a question that people bring up when they're negotiating. They don't always know. I certainly, had to be educated at my first startup on what all this equity meant. So if you already know this, please bear with me as well. So basically, equity is this concept that you have ownership in a company, right? And typically, as an early employee, you get a little bit bigger slice of a pie. Now, how big depends on a couple things. It depends on your experience, and it also depends on what your role is. So if you're coming in as an engineer or product manager or a designer, as a very early employee, 1 through 20, you can expect anywhere from 0.25% to maybe 2% in terms of ownership. If you are an executive level position or a VP or something like that, 3 to 5, maybe even 10, depending on your experience. And if you're potentially going to be one of the co-founders, then 5 to 10%. Unless, of course, you're putting some of your own capital into funding it, in which case you'd have 50% or something like that. So that's your ownership stake that you're given on day one. Now, the thing about equity is, just because they give you that ownership doesn't really mean that it means anything, right? It's like, oh, I have 1% of nothing, right? Because the company has to actually be valued, and only when it's valued does that ownership actually translate to some dollar figure. The other thing about equity is you don't get it from day one, right? It vests. And typically, in the Valley and in other places, you are on what's called a 4-year vesting schedule. That means over the course of 4 years, if you start at 1%, you will earn 0.25% every year. Now, the other caveat is what's known as a 1-year cliff. So that means you've got to stick around for at least 1 full year before you even get your first 0.25%. Why? Well, this is to discourage people from just going and working at a bunch of startups and earning a bunch of equity and then leaving at the year mark, right? Or right before the year mark. It's to encourage for people to stay around and stay committed before they can earn their first portion of the company. So if you do not get to your 365th day, you don't get even that first slice, right? The other thing that I want to warn against is even if you do vest, right, if you decide to leave, then a lot of times companies will put in what's known as a early exercise clause. And what that means is you have the option to early exercise, meaning whatever options you've had, you can purchase them. But then if you leave the company within 90 days, you have to either exercise them, purchase them, or you have to forfeit them, sell them back to the company, right? This is once again to discourage people from messing up what's known as the cap table, meaning having a lot of people kind of coming and going and having ownership of the company who aren't really adding any value, right? So if you go into a company and you don't stick around for the full 4 years, invest completely, and you leave somewhere in there, you want to make sure you look through your contract and see if that 90-day early exercise clause is in there, because it means you're going to have to early exercise in order to have even any percentage of the company. Not everybody does it, but a lot of people do that. Now, the other thing about this is not every company lets you early exercise, right? Some founders are fair, or I wouldn't say fair, but some founders like to give their early employees the chance to early exercise. And if you also leave and you don't believe in the product anymore, you have the option to say, I'd like my money back. I don't want to have any ownership stake in this company, and you can leave. So keep that in mind. Now, the other interesting thing about equity is, like I said, you might start off and they say, here's your 1%, right? So your pie starts to look like this. Well, then over time, if the company gets funding, your pie starts to look a little bit different. Your 1% actually starts to go down. You're like, what the hell? Why is my 1% going down? How could this happen, right? Well, the truth is that, like I said in the beginning, it might not be worth anything, right? You might be 1% of 0. But based on funding rounds, the company gets valued. And usually that valuation gets bigger. This is something else you want to keep track of. You want to make sure that your company's valuation is only increasing, not decreasing. So as it increases, your 1% starts to become a little bit less because they have to take some of your stock, right, and distribute it to new investors. And so your 1% may go down to half, to quarter, etc. But it's worth a whole lot more than it was when you started on day one. So keep that in mind. But ultimately, you're not going to know how much that percentage is until the actual exit event, right? That liquidity event that I talked about. So keep that in mind. Just be aware of it. Don't, worry too much. Now, another question that people ask is salary, right? In those early stages, am I going to be working for sweat equity? Well, it's kind of up to you and the founders. If you want to work for sweat equity, then work for sweat equity. If you don't want to, then mention that. The way that I see it now in the Valley is a lot of early stage companies have actually raised a little bit of seed capital, or the founders are bootstrapping it. So while you might not get market rate, you're getting close to it. The other thing I'll say about salary is just because in that early stage you might not be making market rate does not mean that you should continue to not make market rate, right? If your company is getting revenue, if you have investment that comes in, then you can certainly, and you should, ask for a raise, right? The company is doing better and you deserve to then get that raise. So keep that in mind. You can negotiate for it. In fact, a lot of companies and early employees are getting that put into their contracts or discussing it openly early on, saying, okay, I'm fine with taking a pay cut when I start, but once we get our first Series A round of funding, I would like to make this much money. I'd like to return to my market rate. So you have that option. Talk about a couple things just because you need to know, not because they're anything exciting. So remember I said there is this thing called early exercising in your equity. Well, there's this other thing called alternative minimum tax. And once again, the only reason I bring it up is because I think you should know about it. So if you have this option where you can early exercise, meaning you have not yet fully vested, but maybe you want to go ahead and say, I have 1%, I'm going to, my 1% is worth $100 today, so I'm going to go ahead and pay the company $100 and start my clock, then you can start your clock. Now when you start your clock, this is the long-term capital gains clock. Now, the way that alternative minimum tax works is if your company has that exit event, whether it's an acquisition, IPO, or whatever, if you haven't exercised your stock and held it for a year, then you are subject to what's known as short-term capital gains, which is usually taxed at the higher rate. It's usually like 25, 26%. It might even be more. It's kind of always changing. As opposed to long-term capital gains, which is about 15 to 19%. Once again, that's kind of always changing. So if you want to hedge against that AMT, then ask to early exercise or early exercise when you're given that option. Just wanted you to know about it in case there are any of you out there who care about tax implications. I know that in the late 90s there were a lot of people that went into debt because they didn't know about it and caused a lot of friction. So the other thing I will say is your company can't always advise you, so hire a tax advisor. They're worth every penny.